In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to set up your table saw for accurate cuts in 3 simple steps. My table saw is the DeWalt DW745, but if you have a different saw, you can probably apply the same principles to whatever saw you have, although some of the adjustments might need to be made in different ways. I'd recommend following these steps in the order that they appear in this video to get the best results for accuracy. Before we start, I'm going to unplug the saw just for safety reasons. Step 1 is to set the blade at 90 degrees to the table. The quickest and easiest way to do that is to use a digital angle gauge. There's a link to this in the My Tools section of the description box if you want to check it out. It's a great thing to have and it doesn't cost much money. Make sure that the table is clean and free of dust. Pop it on the table and zero it out. Then pop it on the side of the blade and then using the tilt function of your saw, tilt the blade until it reads 90. If you don't have a digital angle gauge, you can use a small speed square, but make sure that the square you use isn't touching the teeth on the blade because you want to get an accurate reading. Sometimes a light source behind the blade can help you to see any gaps. Once you've got it square, lock down the tilt mechanism, and on this saw there are these cam adjustment knobs. Here's what they look like from inside the saw. There's one of these at each end of the scale which you can lock in place with your screwdriver so that in future you can quickly and easily set the blade to 0 degrees, which is also 90 degrees depending on how you want to think about it, or 45 degrees without having to double check each time you change it. And you can adjust the arrow pointer to the correct reading, although I tend not to rely on that because it's not very accurate. I usually use my digital angle gauge every time I change the angle of the blade. Step 2 is to check that the table saw blade is parallel to the mitre slots. There are various ways to do this. If you have a dial indicator, then that's probably the most accurate way of identifying just how accurately aligned the blade is to the mitre slots. I don't have a dial indicator jig, but I do have some digital calipers, so I'll show you a method using those. First, I cut a piece of wood to fit snugly in the mitre slot with no side-to-side play. And I pick a tooth on the blade that I'm going to use for reference. I'm going to pick this one and I'll mark it up with a Sharpie. The teeth on a blade can vary very slightly in width, even on a new blade, but definitely on a used blade, so it's worth taking all measurements from one specific tooth for maximum accuracy. I then fully raise the blade to its maximum height. I can now use the calipers to measure the distance between that tooth and the piece of wood, making sure to hold the calipers square to the blade. I can then rotate my reference tooth to the back of the saw and measure again. In order to do that, I need to take my riving knife out of the way. Mine seems to be 0.09mm out of alignment, but I'm not really worried about that. That's well within tolerance as far as I'm concerned. And I can do the same again on the opposite mitre slot. If you don't have any digital calipers, another method you can use is to make a simple jig, and I'll show you how to do that now. Using that piece of wood that fits perfectly in the mitre slot, I drill a hole in the centre, and then to that I can add a bolt. I needed to cut away a bit of material just to make space for the head of the bolt. Then I used another piece of wood and drilled a series of holes in the centre of that piece to form a slot, which I can then refine the shape of by doing a little bit of filing. I can then use a washer and a wing nut to secure that piece of wood onto the bolt. And now I can butt the end of that piece of wood right up to the reference tooth, lock down the wing nut and check that the resistance on that tooth is consistent at the back and at the front of the saw. I can use this to check both mitre slots, and this jig packs away nicely too, so I can use it again in future. Another method that I've seen others use is to use a combination square, but I'm not really a fan of that method because the body of the combination square doesn't fit into the mitre slot, and that means that the ruler needs to be at a slight angle in order to touch the tooth. And unless you get that angle perfectly consistent at the front and the back of the saw, it's not really going to be as accurate as the other methods I've shown. If your blade is not parallel to the mitre slots, don't worry, it is adjustable, on this saw at least. You first need to remove the back panel, and then underneath there are these 2 bolts which hold the motor housing to the table. Loosen those and then you can move the table and check again until you get it bob on, but be aware that sometimes when you get the placement just where you want it, when you tighten the bolts it can move a little, so you might need to move it a little more to compensate for the movement when you tighten those bolts. I'm not going to show you how to do that because I know that my blade is well aligned, or within tolerance for me anyway. But if you want to see how to do it in more detail, I'd recommend watching a video by Tamar from the 3x3 custom channel, and I'll link to that in the description box below. And you'll definitely want to subscribe to her channel too, because she and her projects are awesome. Once you get it as accurate as you can, it's time to move on to step 3. Step 3 is to set up your fence for accuracy. If you're confident that you've set your blade parallel to the mitre slots, The lazy option is just to set your fence using the mitre slots, and if you have a piece of wood the exact width of your mitre slots, then it's really easy just to butt up the fence to that. On this saw there are these Allen key bolts that lock the fence onto the rail. These pins are used to realign the fence. This pin references the yellow measuring tape and this one references the white tape, which is used for getting a wider cut capacity. And here you can see the corresponding pins on the rail at the back of the saw. There's also another set of pins if you wanted to use the fence on the left hand side of the blade, but I haven't done that and I've had the saw for about 5 years now, so I'm not going to bother setting that up. Another method is again to use a reference tooth on your blade and then using a dowel between the blade and the fence. Butt up the fence to the end of the dowel. Hold the dowel as close to 90 degrees to the blade as you can. Check the resistance from that tooth to the fence at the front of the saw, and then rotate that reference tooth to the back of the saw and check again. And you want the resistance to feel the same in both positions to know that it's set correctly. And again, if you have a dial indicator, you can check the position of the fence from front to back using that by running it along the mitre slots. Once you have that set perfectly parallel to the blade, you can adjust the marker on your measuring tape either by butting the fence right up to the teeth on the blade, giving it a little bit of a spin just to make sure that it's touching, and then setting the pointer to 0. To check that for accuracy, you can then set the fence to a measurement. I'm going to use 150 millimeters, make a cut, and then measure it with calipers or a tape measure that you trust to see if it's bob on, which it should be. But if it isn't, you can tweak things from there as necessary. A couple of other things that you might want to check. Firstly, that your fence is square to the table, which you can either check using the digital angle gauge again or a reliable square. And secondly, you might want to check that your table is perfectly flat, and that's easy to check using a reliable straight edge. Again, you can use a light source behind it to spot any gaps more easily. If it isn't flat and you just bought it, then you might want to return it to wherever you bought it from. Failing that, you might be able to sand down any high spots on the table to flatten it, but that kind of depends on what the table is made of, and it may not be an easy job. That's all there is to it, and this is something I check periodically just to check that my table saw is cutting as accurately as I can get it to. Even though this is just a contractor saw, it cuts very accurately once it's set up properly. But even the most expensive brand new tools straight from the factory are often not set up as accurately as they perhaps should be. So it's always worth setting things up yourself before using them so you know that it's going to give you the best possible results and also be safe to use. That's it for this one. I hope you found the video useful. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. If you want to help support the channel, you can do so via Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description box below, where you can get early access to my content, free plans and cut lists, exclusive content, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you very much for watching.